Sarah Marshall glanced at her car's dashboard clock for the fifth time in 2 minutes. It was 8:45 a.m., and she was already running 15 minutes late for the most important meeting of her career. Her dark brown hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she navigated through the busy morning traffic of downtown. As the head of the Metropolitan Criminal Task Force, she couldn't afford any delays today. Her team had spent 6 months building a case against one of the city's most dangerous drug cartels, and this morning's briefing would determine if they got the green light for their operation. Sarah had purposely dressed down today, worn jeans, a simple black t-shirt, and her natural hair tied back in a neat bun. Her badge and service weapon were carefully hidden in her shoulder bag. Working undercover meant maintaining appearances at all times, even when rushing to headquarters. The familiar streets of her daily route were unusually congested. Road work had forced her to take a detour through the local school district. Sarah knew she needed to make up for lost time, but she also knew better than to speed in a school zone. Still, when the traffic finally cleared, she pressed down on the accelerator just a little harder than she should have. The flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror made her heart sink. "Not today," Sarah muttered under her breath as she carefully pulled her 10-year-old Toyota to the curb. She watched in her side mirror as a young patrol officer approached her car. Officer Tom Jenkins, according to his nameplate, couldn't have been more than a few years out of the academy. "License and registration, ma'am," he said, his tone carrying that familiar mix of authority and caution that all rookie officers seem to share. Sarah could have easily reached for her badge. One flash of her task force credentials would have probably earned her a pass. But years of undercover work had taught her the value of maintaining her cover at all times. One slip, one person who saw her get special treatment, could jeopardize months of careful investigation. "Of course, officer," she replied, keeping her voice neutral as she reached for her glove compartment. The registration was right where it should be, and her license was easily accessible in her wallet. She handed both over without complaint. Officer Jenkins studied her documents carefully. "Miss Marshall, do you know why I pulled you over today?" Sarah resisted the urge to smile at the mice. If he only knew about her doctorate in criminal justice. "I imagine I was going a bit fast," he answered honestly. "You were doing 38 in a 25 zone, he confirmed, his pen already moving across his notepad. "In a school zone, ma'am. That's a serious violation." Sarah nodded, accepting the rebuke. She had been wrong, regardless of her reasons. "You're absolutely right, officer. I apologize." The young officer seemed slightly taken aback by her easy admission of guilt. He probably expected argument or excuses. "I'll be right back with your citation," he said, returning to his patrol car. As she waited, Sarah's phone buzzed with another message from her team. Assistant Director Thompson was already at headquarters, waiting for her presentation. She sent a quick text explaining she'd be further delayed, careful to keep her hands visible through the car window as she did so. Officer Jenkins returned 5 minutes later with a ticket. "Here's your citation, ma'am. You can either pay the fine or contest it in traffic court. All the information you need is printed on the back." "Thank you, officer," Sarah replied, accepting the ticket without argument. As the patrol car pulled away, she finally allowed herself a small sigh. The fine would be steep. Speeding tickets in school zones always were. But that wasn't what bothered her. She'd have to appear in court next week, right in the middle of their operation's crucial phase. Starting her car again, Sarah merged carefully back into traffic, this time keeping strictly to the speed limit. Her phone buzzed again, but she ignored it. The morning's events had reminded her of an important lesson she often taught to new officers. No case, no matter how important, was worth putting others at risk. As she finally pulled into the federal building's parking garage, Sarah tucked both the ticket and her frustration away in her bag. She had a job to do, and she would do it well, just as she had for the past 15 years. The fact that she'd have to face a traffic judge next week was just another challenge to handle with the same professionalism she brought to everything else. Little did she know that this simple traffic stop would set in motion events that would challenge not just her professionalism, but the deeply rooted prejudices within the very system she served. 2 weeks later, Sarah Marshall sat on the hard wooden bench in Traffic Courtroom 304, watching as Judge Richard Whitman handled case after case. She had chosen to wear the same casual outfit from the day of her ticket, part of maintaining her cover, but also a conscious choice to experience the system as an ordinary citizen. The courtroom was cramped and stuffy, filled with the nervous energy of people waiting for their cases to be called. Sarah noticed how Judge Whitman's treatment of defendants seemed to vary. Some received patient explanations and reduced fines, while others faced stern lectures and maximum penalties. As a veteran law enforcement officer, these patterns didn't escape her notice. Case number 247, Sarah Marshall, the court clerk called out, her voice tired from a morning of announcements. Sarah stood and walked confidently to the podium. Judge Whitman barely looked up from his papers as she approached. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses that he peered over as he finally acknowledged her presence. Ms. Marshall, you were cited for driving 38 miles per hour in a school zone, Judge Whitman stated, his tone carrying the boredom of someone who'd rather be somewhere else. How you played? Guilty, Your Honor, Sarah replied respectfully. But I'd like to explain the circumstances if I may. Judge Whitman's expression hardened slightly. Ms. Marshall, do you know how many people come through this court with explanations? Everyone has a story. Everyone has somewhere they needed to be. Sarah noticed how he cut her off before she could even begin, something he hadn't done with several previous defendants. I understand, Your Honor, but the posted speed limit in school zones is very clear, he interrupted again, his voice taking on a condescending tone. 25 miles per hour, not 26, not 30, and certainly not 38. There were children in that area. Yes, Your Honor, Sarah responded, maintaining her composure. Years of undercover work had taught her to control her reactions, even in the face of unfair treatment. Judge Whitman shuffled through some papers on his desk, though Sarah could tell he wasn't really reading them. I see here you have no prior traffic violations. However, given the severity of the offense and the location, I'm inclined to impose the maximum fine. Sarah watched as he scribbled something on her citation. In the gallery behind her, she heard the subtle murmurs of other waiting defendants. They too had noticed how different his tone was now compared to his handling of previous cases. The fine is $575, Judge Whitman announced, not bothering to look up. Plus court costs of $125. You have 30 days to pay. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Sarah replied calmly, though she couldn't help but notice this was nearly double what he fined another driver for the same offense just 20 minutes earlier. Next time, Ms. Marshall, I suggest you leave earlier if you need to get somewhere. Running late is not an excuse to endanger children's lives. His tone was sharp, almost patronizing, as if he were speaking to a child rather than a grown woman. As Sarah turned to leave the podium, she caught sight of a familiar face entering the courtroom through the back door. Assistant Director Thompson. He was early for their afternoon briefing with the judge about the task force operation. His eyes widened slightly as he recognized her, but Sarah gave him a subtle shake of her head. Now wasn't the time. Next case, Judge Whitman called out, already forgetting about Sarah as she walked back to her seat. Sarah gathered her things quietly, noting how the judge's demeanor immediately shifted as he addressed the next defendant, a young white man in a business suit who had been caught speeding on the highway. The judge's tone became almost friendly as he reduced the man's fine and offered him an extended payment plan. As she left the courtroom, Sarah couldn't help but smile slightly. In just a few hours, she would be seeing Judge Whitman again, though under very different circumstances. She had spent 15 years building her career, earning her position through hard work and dedication. The judge's dismissive treatment stung, but she knew that sometimes the best lessons came from unexpected places. Walking toward the elevator, Sarah checked her watch. She had just enough time to change into her formal attire before the afternoon's task force briefing. She wondered how Judge Whitman would react when he realized the woman he had just treated so dismissively would be leading one of the biggest criminal investigations in the city's history. After leaving the courtroom, Sarah headed straight to the fourth-floor women's restroom of the courthouse. She carried a small gym bag containing her change of clothes, a crisp navy blue suit, white blouse, and polished black heels. The transformation from casual civilian to task force commander was one she had performed countless times before. As she changed, Sarah's mind wandered back to the morning's court session. In her 15 years of law enforcement, she had seen many forms of prejudice, but watching it unfold in Judge Whitman's courtroom had been particularly eye-opening. The memory of his dismissive tone made her shake her head as she buttoned her blazer. Her phone buzzed with a text from Assistant Director Thompson. "Ready when you are, Commander. Room 442 is set up for the briefing." Sarah checked her appearance one final time in the mirror. Her natural hair was now pulled back into a professional bun, her badge hung prominently from her neck, and her service weapon was properly holstered at her hip. The casual woman Judge Whitman had looked down upon was gone, replaced by the commanding officer she truly was. But before heading to the briefing room, Sarah had one more stop to make. She wanted to observe Judge Whitman's afternoon session from the back of the courtroom. It wasn't just curiosity, it was her investigator's instinct at work. Slipping quietly into courtroom 304, Sarah stood in the shadows near the back wall. The afternoon session was in full swing, and the patterns she had noticed earlier were even more apparent now. A young Hispanic mother was at the podium, trying to explain her situation to Judge Whitman. "Your Honor, I was rushing my sick child to the doctor," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "The law doesn't make exceptions for personal emergencies," Judge Whitman replied coldly, not even looking at the woman's supporting medical documents. "The fine stands at $450. Minutes later, an elderly white businessman approached for a similar violation. "Ah, Mr. Peterson," Judge Whitman's tone immediately warmed. "I understand you were late for an important meeting." "Yes, Your Honor. First-time offense," the man replied confidently. "Given your clean record and community standing, I'll reduce the fine to $200, Judge Whitman announced with a smile. Sarah felt her jaw tighten. The contrast was stark and unmistakable. She pulled out her small notepad, the one she used for investigations, and began jotting down observations, times, names, fines, and the judge's varying responses. As a task force commander, she knew the value of documented patterns. Her phone vibrated again. Another message from Thompson. "Judge is scheduled for our briefing in 30 minutes. Everything okay?" Sarah texted back a quick confirmation. She had seen enough. As she turned to leave, she nearly bumped into Court Officer Jenkins, the same officer who had given her the ticket 2 weeks ago. His eyes widened in recognition, then even wider as he took in her current appearance. "Detective Marshall," he whispered, clearly confused by her transformation. Sarah gave him a small smile and touched a finger to her lips, signaling for discretion. Officer Jenkins nodded, understanding immediately. Like most law enforcement officers in the city, he knew about the ongoing task force investigation, even if he didn't know all the details. As Sarah walked toward the elevator, her mind was already shifting to the upcoming briefing. Her team had spent months building a case against the Rivera drug cartel. They had mapped out the entire operation, traced money laundering schemes, and identified key players. All they needed now was judicial support for their wiretap requests and search warrants. And the judge they needed to convince? Richard Whitman. Sarah smiled slightly as the elevator doors closed. In just a few minutes, Judge Whitman would learn that the woman he had treated so dismissively in traffic court was not only a decorated detective, but the commander of the city's most elite task force. However, she wouldn't let his earlier behavior affect her presentation. The case was too important for personal feelings. The elevator stopped at the 4th floor, and Sarah stepped out, her heels clicking confidently on the marble floor. Several officers nodded respectfully as she passed. At the end of the hall, she could see Assistant Director Thompson waiting outside room 442, case files in hand. It was time to show Judge Whitman exactly who Sarah Marshall really was. Not that she owed him any explanation. Sometimes she thought the best response to prejudice was simply to excel at what you do. Judge Richard Whitman straightened his tie as he walked down the 4th-floor hallway of the federal building. After a long morning of traffic court, he was looking forward to something more significant, a briefing about a major criminal investigation. These were the moments that made him feel truly important in the justice system. As he approached room 442, Assistant Director Thompson greeted him with a firm handshake. "Thank you for making time for this briefing, Judge Whitman. The task force commander is waiting inside with the team." Of course, Judge Whitman replied, puffing up slightly with self-importance. "Always happy to assist with serious law enforcement matters, unlike the minor nuisances I deal with in traffic court." Thompson's expression remained neutral, though there was an odd glint in his eye. "I'm sure today will be enlightening," he said, opening the door. Judge Whitman stepped into the conference room and froze. Seated at the head of the long table was a familiar face, the same woman he had found just hours ago. But now, Sarah Marshall looked completely different. Gone were the casual clothes, replaced by a sharp navy suit. A badge hung prominently around her neck, and the stars on her collar indicated her high rank. "Good afternoon, Judge Whitman," Sarah said professionally, standing to greet him. Her voice carried the natural authority of someone used to commanding rooms full of seasoned law enforcement officers. "I'm Commander Sarah Marshall, head of the Metropolitan Criminal Task Force. We appreciate you joining us today." The color drained from Judge Whitman's face as recognition and realization hit him simultaneously. Around the table, 12 other task force members watched the scene unfold, their expressions carefully controlled. "Please, have a seat." Sarah gestured to an empty chair, acting as if she had never seen him before. "We have a lot to cover regarding the Rivera cartel investigation." Judge Whitman sank into the offered chair, his usual confidence notably absent. He watched in stunned silence as Sarah began the briefing, expertly walking through complex surveillance operations, financial investigations, and proposed tactical plans. Over the past 6 months, Sarah explained, clicking through detailed presentation slides, our task force has identified 17 key members of the Rivera organization. We've mapped their distribution network across 3 states and tracked over $20 million in laundered funds. The judge could barely focus on the content. His mind kept replaying his condescending behavior in traffic court. Each time Sarah demonstrated her expertise, which was frequently, he felt himself shrink a little more in his chair. "These are the wiretap applications we'll need approved," Sarah continued, sliding a thick folder toward him. "We've included all supporting evidence and probable cause documentation. Given the scope of this operation, we'd appreciate expedited review." Judge Whitman fumbled with his reading glasses, hyper-aware of how his hands were shaking slightly. The same hands that had so dismissively written out her traffic fine just hours earlier. Of course, Commander Marshall," he managed to say. "I'll review these immediately." Sarah nodded professionally. "Thank you, Your Honor." Now, regarding the tactical approach, she continued the briefing without missing a beat, never acknowledging their earlier encounter. For the next hour, Judge Whitman watched as Sarah masterfully led the discussion, answering complex questions from FBI agents, DEA officers, and federal prosecutors. Her grasp of both legal nuances and operational details was impressive. This was clearly someone who had earned her position through years of dedicated work and exceptional competence. As the briefing concluded, team members began filing out of the room, each showing clear respect for their commander. Judge Whitman remained seated, feeling both embarrassed and humbled. "Commander Marshall," he started to say, but Sarah was already gathering her materials. "The task force will need those wiretap approvals by Friday, Your Honor," she said professionally, her tone making it clear that their traffic court interaction was irrelevant to the important work at hand. "If you have any questions about the applications, Assistant Director Thompson can assist you." With that, she picked up her briefcase and walked out, leaving Judge Whitman sitting there, confronted with his own prejudices in the most unexpected way. Thompson, the last person in the room besides the judge, paused at the door. "Commander Marshall has the highest closure rate in the department's history," he said quietly. "She's also completed her doctorate in criminal justice. Just thought you might want to know." Judge Whitman remained in his chair long after everyone had gone, the weight of his morning's behavior sitting heavy on his shoulders. 3 days after the briefing, Sarah Marshall stood in the task force's command center, surrounded by monitors displaying surveillance feeds from across the city. It was 4:30 a.m., and the biggest operation of her career was about to begin. The signed warrants from Judge Whitman had arrived yesterday, all approved in record time. "All teams check in," Sarah commanded into her radio, her voice steady and confident. One by one, the responses came in from the 6 tactical teams positioned around the city. Each team consisted of officers from different agencies, FBI, DEA, and local police, all united under her leadership. Alpha Team, in position. Bravo Team, ready. Charlie Team, standing by. Delta Team, good to go. Echo Team, in position. Foxtrot Team, ready and waiting. Assistant Director Thompson stood beside her, watching as she coordinated the massive operation. He couldn't help but remember Judge Whitman's face during the briefing 3 days ago. Now, seeing Sarah in her element, the judge's previous assumptions seemed even more ridiculous. "All teams, execute on my mark," Sarah spoke clearly into the radio. The surveillance screen showed her teams hidden around various locations: warehouses, luxury apartments, and storage facilities, all connected to the Rivera cartel. 6 months of careful investigation had led to this moment. Sarah checked her watch. 3, 2, 1. Execute, execute, execute. The command center erupted with radio chatter as all teams moved simultaneously. On the monitors, they watched as officers breached doors and secured locations. Sarah remained calm, responding to each team's updates and coordinating their movements with precision. "Charlie team, be advised. Suspects are moving toward the back exit," she directed, watching their feed. "Delta team, intercept at point 4. The operation moved like clockwork. Years of experience had taught Sarah that success depended on timing and coordination. She had personally selected and trained many of the officers participating today, and their professionalism showed. "Commander," a voice crackled over the radio, "we've secured Miguel Rivera and 3 lieutenants at the primary location." "Excellent work, Alpha Team," Sarah responded. "Secure the evidence and begin documentation." As the morning progressed, reports of arrests and seized evidence kept flowing in. Sarah maintained her calm demeanor, but inside she felt proud of her team's execution. They had just dismantled one of the largest drug operations in the city's history. Around 7:00 a.m., as the operation was winding down, the command center door opened. Judge Whitman walked in, having been invited to observe the execution of his warrants. He stopped short, watching Sarah direct the final phases of the operation with obvious expertise. "Commander," an officer called out, "final numbers coming in. 23 suspects in custody, including all primary targets. Approximately 40 million in drugs seized, plus 15 million in cash and assets." Sarah nodded, making notes on her tablet. "Excellent work, everyone. Begin processing and documentation. I want everything handled by the book. These cases need to be airtight for prosecution." Judge Whitman observed silently from the back of the room. The commander he watched now was a far cry from the woman he had lectured in traffic court. Here was someone who commanded respect not through authority, but through competence and leadership. As the operation concluded, Sarah finally addressed the room. "Outstanding work, all teams. This operation was successful because every one of you did your job professionally and precisely. The city is safer today because of your efforts." Officers began filtering out, many stopping to shake Sarah's hand or give her respectful nods. She had earned their respect through years of dedicated service and successful operations just like this one. Finally, Sarah noticed Judge Whitman standing in the back. She approached him professionally, manila folder in hand. "Your Honor, I wanted to personally deliver the operation summary for your records. The warrants you signed led to significant arrests and seizures." Judge Whitman accepted the folder, clearly uncomfortable. "Commander Marshall, If you'll excuse me," Sarah said politely but firmly, "I need to begin processing the suspects. We'll have detailed reports ready for the prosecutor's office by tomorrow morning." As she walked away, Judge Whitman watched her stop to thank individual team members and check on their well-being. Here was a leader who cared about her people, knew her job inside and out, and executed her duties with exceptional skill, regardless of what others might assume about her at first glance. The afternoon following the successful operation, Sarah sat in her office reviewing arrest reports when a knock came at her door. Through the glass, she could see Judge Whitman standing awkwardly in the hallway, holding what appeared to be a manila envelope. "Come in," Sarah called out, keeping her tone professional. She noticed how different the judge looked now, his usual confidence replaced by obvious discomfort. "Commander Marshall," Judge Whitman began, carefully closing the door behind him, "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Sarah gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Just reviewing reports from yesterday's operation. What can I do for you, Your Honor?" The judge sat down, placing the envelope on his lap. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to begin. The powerful presence he usually displayed in his courtroom was nowhere to be seen. I owe you an apology, he finally said, his voice quiet but sincere. My behavior in traffic court was inappropriate and unprofessional. Sarah leaned back in her chair, studying him carefully. In her 15 years of law enforcement, she had learned to read people well. The judge's discomfort seemed genuine. You know, Judge Whitman, she replied thoughtfully, that traffic stop happened because I was running late to prepare for an operation that saved lives. I accepted the ticket because it was the right thing to do. My job doesn't put me above the law. The judge nodded, looking down at his hands. But my treatment of you in court was unfortunately not unusual, Sarah finished for him. She opened a drawer and pulled out a small notebook. During my time in your courtroom, I observed something interesting. Would you like to know what I saw? Judge Whitman looked up, surprised by her direct approach. Please. In 1 hour, you heard 12 cases. The average fine for white defendants was $235. For defendants of color, it was $485. White defendants were offered payment plans 80% of the time. Others had to ask specifically and were often denied. The judge's face paled as Sarah shared her observations. As a longtime investigator, taking detailed notes was second nature to her. I had no idea, he stammered. I never intentionally. Most bias isn't intentional, Your Honor, Sarah said, her tone remaining professional but firm. That's what makes it so dangerous. We all carry assumptions and prejudices. The question is, what do we do when they're pointed out to us? Judge Whitman opened the envelope he had brought and pulled out a stack of papers. I spent last night reviewing my cases from the past month, he admitted. The patterns, they're undeniable. I've already contacted the Judicial Review Board to request implicit bias training. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's a good first step. I also have this, he said, placing a document on her desk. It was her traffic fine receipt, marked VOID. I know you can afford the fine, Commander, but... Sarah held up her hand, stopping him. With all due respect, Your Honor, I will pay that fine. Not because you were fair in giving it to me, you weren't. But because I did speed in a school zone, and actions have consequences. Voiding it now would just be another form of special treatment. The judge sat back, clearly surprised by her response. Sarah continued, her voice firm but understanding. What I would prefer instead is for you to remember this experience. Remember how easily you dismissed me based on my appearance. Remember how wrong those assumptions were. Then apply that lesson to everyone who enters your courtroom. You're absolutely right, Judge Whitman replied quietly. Every person deserves to be treated with respect and judged only by their actions, not their appearance. Sarah stood up, signaling the end of their conversation. I have another operation to plan, Your Honor. But I appreciate you coming here today. It takes courage to acknowledge our mistakes. As Judge Whitman reached the door, he turned back. Commander Marshall, would you be willing to speak at our next judicial training session? Share your perspective with other judges? Sarah smiled slightly. Send me the details, and I'll consider it. Change happens one conversation at a time. After the judge left, Sarah looked at the traffic ticket still on her desk. Sometimes, she thought, the most important lessons come from unexpected places. Tomorrow, she would pay the fine, not because it was fair, but because it had sparked a conversation that might help create a fairer system for everyone else. 3 months after his conversation with Commander Marshall, Judge Richard Whitman sat alone in his chambers late one evening. Spread across his desk were hundreds of case files, every traffic court decision he had made over the past year. What he saw in those files had changed him deeply. His computer screen displayed the results of his personal investigation into his own behavior. Using a spreadsheet, he had tracked fines, payment plans, and dismissals across different demographic groups. The numbers told a story he couldn't ignore anymore. Your Honor? His clerk, Jenny, knocked on the door. The bias training instructor is here for your scheduled session. Judge Whitman nodded, closing the file he was reviewing. This was his 6th training session since that day with Commander Marshall. Each week, he learned more about how unconscious prejudices affected his decisions. Send her in, please, he replied, straightening his desk. Dr. Patricia Chen, an expert in judicial bias, entered the room. She had been working with Judge Whitman since he requested the training program. "Good evening, Judge. Ready to review your latest courtroom data?" "Yes," he answered, turning his computer screen toward her. "I've been tracking my decisions carefully, just as Commander Marshall suggested." Dr. Chen sat down and studied the numbers. "I see significant improvements since we started. Your fine amounts are more consistent across all demographics, and payment plans are being offered more equitably." Judge Whitman pulled out his new courtroom notebook, something he had started keeping after seeing Commander Marshall's detailed documentation. "I've also begun writing down my reasoning for each decision before announcing it. It helps me check my assumptions." "That's excellent progress," Dr. Chen noted. "How are you feeling about the changes?" The judge was quiet for a moment, thinking about how much his perspective had shifted. "I keep thinking about that day in traffic court," he admitted. "If Commander Marshall had been wearing her uniform, I would have treated her completely differently. That realization, it bothers me deeply." "Recognition is the first step toward change," Dr. Chen reminded him. "What matters is what you do with that recognition." Judge Whitman opened another file on his computer. "I've started a mentoring program for other judges. We meet weekly to review our decisions and discuss potential biases. 5 other judges have joined so far." As they continued their session, Judge Whitman's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Commander Marshall. "First Rivera cartel case goes to trial next week. You're assigned to hear it. Looking forward to seeing the new approach in action." The message reminded him of how this journey had started. The shame he had felt in that briefing room had transformed into determination to be better. He had spent decades believing he was a fair judge, only to discover how many people he had treated unjustly because of his unconscious biases. "Dr. Chen," he said, turning back to his instructor, "I'd like to discuss something new I'm implementing. Starting next week, I'm requiring all traffic court sessions to be recorded and reviewed for bias patterns. I want complete transparency." "That's a significant step," Dr. Chen replied, impressed. "What inspired this decision?" Judge Whitman picked up the small notebook on his desk. "Commander Marshall showed me the power of documentation. If we're truly committed to fairness, we should be willing to examine our actions openly." As their session concluded, Judge Whitman walked to his courtroom. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new decisions, and new opportunities to apply what he had learned. The room looked different to him now, not just a place of judgment, but a place where justice needed to be truly blind. He sat in his chair, remembering how he used to view his role. He had always taken pride in being a judge, but now he understood that true justice required constant self-examination and willingness to change. On his bench, he placed his new courtroom motto, printed in clear letters: "Judge actions, not appearances." It was a daily reminder of the lesson Commander Marshall had taught him. One traffic ticket had opened his eyes to years of unconscious bias. As he gathered his things to leave, Judge Whitman noticed a young law student observing the courtroom. "Interested in becoming a judge?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor," the student replied eagerly. "Remember this," he said, gesturing to his motto. "Our job is to deliver justice equally, regardless of who stands before us. The moment we forget that is the moment we stop serving justice." 6 months after the Rivera cartel operation, Commander Sarah Marshall sat in the back of courtroom 304, observing a very different Judge Whitman from the one she had first encountered. She wasn't there officially, just curious to see if the changes she had heard about were real. The judge's demeanor had transformed completely. Each person who stepped before him received the same respectful attention, regardless of their appearance or background. His new approach was obvious in every interaction. "Case number 156, traffic violation," the clerk announced. A young man in worn clothes approached the podium nervously. Judge Whitman looked up with the same respectful expression he had shown to everyone else that morning. "Good morning, sir," the judge said warmly. "Please state your name for the record." "James Rodriguez, Your Honor," the man replied, his voice shaking slightly. Sarah watched as Judge Whitman carefully reviewed the citation, taking notes in what she recognized as one of the documentation notebooks she had inspired him to use. The scene reminded her of her own experience 6 months ago, but the similarities ended there. "Mr. Rodriguez, I see this is your first offense," Judge Whitman stated clearly. "Would you like to explain the circumstances?" The young man explained his situation. He had been rushing to his second job, trying to make ends meet. The judge listened attentively, showing no trace of the dismissive attitude he once displayed. "Thank you for your honesty," Judge Whitman said. "Given the circumstances and your clean record, I'm reducing the fine and offering a payment plan. The clerk will help you set that up." Sarah nodded approvingly from her seat. The change wasn't just in his words, it was in his entire approach to justice. After the morning session, Sarah was about to leave when she noticed a group of law students entering the courtroom. Judge Whitman had started a new program inviting future legal professionals to observe and learn about unbiased judicial practice. "Commander Marshall," Judge Whitman called out, spotting her. "Would you mind joining us? I was just about to share a story that you're very much a part of." Sarah smiled and walked to the front of the courtroom. The students looked at her with interest as Judge Whitman began speaking. "6 months ago," he told the students, "I made a serious mistake. I let my unconscious biases affect my judgment. I looked at someone and made assumptions based on their appearance. That person turned out to be one of the most competent law enforcement officers I've ever met." The students listened intently as he continued. "Commander Marshall here taught me a valuable lesson about true justice. Since then, we've implemented several changes in this court." He gestured to the recording equipment and the stack of documentation notebooks. "Every decision is recorded, reviewed, and analyzed for bias. Every fine and ruling is documented with clear reasoning." One of the students raised her hand. "Has it made a difference, Your Honor?" Judge Whitman looked at Sarah before answering. "Our latest audit shows that our sentencing and fine disparities have dropped by 87%. Payment plans are now offered equally to all defendants. More importantly, people leave this courtroom feeling heard and respected, regardless of the outcome." Sarah stepped forward. "The law should be applied equally to everyone," she added, "whether you're a task force commander or someone working 2 jobs to make ends meet." After the students left, Judge Whitman turned to Sarah. "I never properly thanked you, Commander. Your traffic ticket changed more than just my courtroom. It's changing the entire district. 3 other judges have adopted our documentation system." Sarah smiled. "Sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected places, Your Honor. Though I did pay that ticket in full." "As you should have," he agreed with a chuckle. "Speeding in a school zone is still speeding, regardless of who's behind the wheel." As Sarah left the courthouse, she felt satisfied. Real change wasn't just about one person or one courtroom. It was about creating a ripple effect that could transform an entire system. Her simple traffic ticket had sparked a conversation that was now helping ensure fairness for countless others. Back in his chambers, Judge Whitman added a new note to his daily reminder. "Justice sees actions, not appearances." Below it, he wrote the date of Sarah's traffic ticket, a simple moment that had transformed not just his career, but his entire understanding of what it meant to be truly just.